The moment Daniel Barnett heard those three words come out of Ida Vaughn's mouth, something cracked open inside his chest that he had spent 3 years carefully sealing shut. He was standing on that porch, the late afternoon sun bleeding copper across the Texas hill country, and the buyer from San Antonio had his hat in his hands and a bank draft folded in his breast pocket that would have cleared every debt Daniel owed, and then some. Behind the buyer stood two more men, one from Austin and one from as far away as St. Louis, all three of them having ridden out to Cedar Ridge Ranch within the span of 48 hours, all three of them waving numbers at Daniel that would have made a lesser man weep with relief. And then Ida said it. She was standing at the far end of the porch, her hands resting on the worn railing, her dark hair loose in a way it never was in town, and she said it quietly, almost to herself, as if she hadn't meant for anyone to hear. But Daniel heard it. He heard it the way a man hears a gunshot across a silent valley, immediate and total and impossible to unhear. "I love this porch," she said, 3 words. No declaration of love for him, no sweeping romantic confession, just a woman pressing her palms to old pine wood and telling it something true. And yet those 3 words, aimed at a stretch of weathered timber and a view of rolling cedar-dotted hills, undid every reasonable calculation Daniel had been making for the better part of 2 months. He turned to the man from San Antonio and said, "I'm not selling." The man blinked. "Mr. Barnett, I don't think you understand the offer I'm prepared to." "I understand it perfectly," Daniel said. "I'm not selling." He looked at the man from Austin, who had gone pale. He looked at the man from St. Louis, who was already putting his hat back on his head with the resigned air of someone who had seen a deal die before. Daniel turned his back on all 3 of them, and when he turned, he was facing Ida, and she was staring at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something frightened and wide open and entirely unguarded. That was the moment everything changed. But to understand why Daniel Barnett turned down more money than most men in Kerrville, Texas would see in a lifetime, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the February morning 8 months earlier, when a stranger named Ida Vaughn stepped off the stage from San Antonio with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of introduction in the other. And every careful wall Daniel had built around himself after the worst year of his life began, without his permission, to come down. The winter of 1882 had been brutal in the hill country. The Guadalupe River had frozen at its edges for the first time in living memory, and the cedar elms had shed their bark in long pale strips, as if the cold had frightened even the trees. Daniel Barnett had spent January alone at Cedar Ridge, doing what he had been doing since the summer of 1879 when his wife, Clara, died of fever 2 days after delivering their stillborn son. He worked. He worked until his hands bled, until his back seized, until there was no room left in his body for anything as dangerous as feeling. Cedar Ridge was 1,000 acres of limestone hills and creek bottomland northwest of Kerrville, and it had been in the Barnett family since Daniel's father broke ground in 1851, the year Daniel was born. The land was beautiful in the way that Texas hill country is always beautiful, fierce and stubborn and full of hidden water. And Daniel loved it the way men love things they never had to choose, things that were simply part of them from birth. But by the winter of 1882, Cedar Ridge was in trouble. A drought in 1880 had killed a quarter of the cattle herd, and a bad investment in a freight concern in San Antonio had drained the operating account. Daniel had been paying the ranch's debts slowly and methodically, the way he did everything, but the pressure had mounted until word had gotten out that Cedar Ridge might be on the market. That was when the buyers started circling. The first letter arrived from a land speculator in Austin in November of 1882. The second came from a cattle baron's agent in San Antonio in December. The third was a personal inquiry from a St. Louis industrialist named Hartwell, who was purchasing Texas land, the way other men collected pocket watches. Daniel had written back to all 3 with polite but noncommittal responses, playing them against each other in his mind, the way a chess player weighs pieces, not because he wanted to sell, but because he was beginning to believe he might have no choice. And then, in the first week of February 1883, his neighbor and closest friend, a rancher named Tom Aldridge, showed up at Daniel's kitchen door with a letter and an uncomfortable expression. "Had a boarder at my place for 2 weeks," Tom said, setting the letter on Daniel's kitchen table. "Woman from Philadelphia, schoolteacher. She came west looking for honest work, and she's as capable as anybody I've met. My wife likes her, which counts for something. Her name is Ida Vaughn. She's 28 years old, she's educated, she's decent, and she needs a position." He paused. "You need a housekeeper, Daniel. You need someone in this house. You've been eating dried beef in despair for 3 years." Daniel looked at the letter without picking it up. "I don't need a housekeeper." "You need something," Tom said, with the frankness of a man who had been a friend long enough to say hard things. Daniel had not responded immediately. He had waited 3 days, reading Ida Vaughn's letter of introduction twice, then a third time, noting the clear, unornamented handwriting, the precise grammar, the complete absence of self-pity despite the circumstances she described. A father recently dead. A position at a Philadelphia girls' school dissolved when the school closed. A decision to come west because there was, as she put it, more room out here for a person to become useful. He had written back offering the position of housekeeper and cook at Cedar Ridge at a wage of $12 a month with room and board, and had half expected not to hear from her again. She arrived on a Tuesday. He had sent his ranch hand, a quiet Mexican-American man named Santos Reyes, to collect her from the stage stop in Kerrville, because Daniel had told himself he was too busy to go himself, which was a lie he was barely aware of telling. He was standing at the fence of the horse corral when the wagon came up the ranch road, and he watched her climb down from the wagon seat with her carpetbag and a smaller bag that clinked softly, as if it contained glass, and he noted several things about Ida Vaughn in rapid succession. She was taller than he had imagined, though he wasn't sure why he had imagined anything at all. She moved with a kind of deliberate economy, nothing wasted, nothing performed. When Santos said something to her in Spanish, she answered him in Spanish, not perfectly but well enough, and Santos raised his eyebrows and then smiled, which was not something Daniel had ever seen Santos do in response to a new arrival. She had dark eyes and a quality of stillness about her that was unusual in a person who had just completed a 2-week journey from Philadelphia to the Texas Hill Country. Daniel pushed off the fence and walked over. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Mr. Barnett," she said, and looked at him directly, which he registered with a kind of internal start, because women in Kerrville generally did not look at him that directly on first meeting, having been trained by convention to look slightly aside. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult," he said. "It was exactly as difficult as I expected," she said, and picked up her own carpetbag before he could reach for it, which settled the question of whether she was the kind of woman who required things done for her. "Santos will show you to your room," Daniel said. "The kitchen is at the rear of the house. I eat breakfast at 5:30, dinner at noon, and supper at 6. I don't require anything elaborate." "I'll manage," she said, and followed Santos toward the house. Daniel stood in the yard for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, looking at nothing in particular, and then went back to work. The first 2 weeks at Cedar Ridge were characterized by a careful, mutual distance that suited them both. Ida learned the kitchen and the pantry and the patterns of a working ranch household with an efficiency that impressed even Daniel, who had not expected to be impressed. She was awake before he was every morning, the kitchen warm and the coffee ready by 5, and she kept the house with a thoroughness that his mother would have approved of. But she was not, as he had half feared, a hovering or chatty presence. She spoke when she had something to say and was quiet when she didn't, and the silence she maintained was the comfortable kind rather than the strained kind, which was a distinction Daniel had not known he was capable of making until he encountered it. He learned small things about her in the way you learn things about someone who does not offer information freely. She read at night by the sitting room lamp, borrowing books from the small shelf his mother had assembled decades ago. She was left-handed. She had a habit, when she was working through something difficult, of pressing two fingers briefly to her temple as if taking her own pulse. She had brought a small collection of glass botanical specimens in that clinking bag, pressed flowers sealed between glass panes, and she had arranged them on the narrow windowsill of her room with the care of someone installing something irreplaceable. The first real conversation they had was about water. Daniel had been examining the eastern creek, which was running low despite the February rains, and when he came back to the house, Ida was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the orchard his mother had planted, which had been struggling for 2 years. She said, without turning around, "The apple trees need more water than they're getting from the current irrigation channel. If you rerouted the small branch from the creek directly to the orchard, it would help. The soil there is good, but it's dry 6 inches down." Daniel stopped in the doorway. "How do you know that?" "I dug down to check," she said, and turned around. "I hoped that was all right. I wanted to understand the land." He looked at her for a moment. "You wanted to understand the land," he repeated. "Is that strange?" "For a schoolteacher from Philadelphia," he said. "Yes." Something moved in her eyes that might have been amusement. "My grandfather farmed in Pennsylvania. I spent summers with him. I know what good soil looks like, and I know what thirsty trees look like." She paused. "The land here is remarkable, by the way. I've never seen anything like it." Daniel sat down at the kitchen table, which was something he rarely did in the middle of the day, and said, "What do you mean?" And Ida Vaughn, who had been scrupulously professional for 2 weeks, sat down across from him and told him what she meant, which turned out to be a lot. She talked about the limestone geology, which she had read about on the stage, and the way the cedar and live oak grew together as if each needed the other, and the particular quality of the light in the mornings when the mist came off the creek. She talked about it the way someone talks about a person they are just beginning to realize they are falling in love with, not knowing yet that that is what is happening, just describing what they see with an honesty that is almost painful to witness. Daniel listened. He had not been in the habit of listening to anyone talk about Cedar Ridge with anything other than the measuring, acquisitive interest of potential buyers. Listening to someone speak about it, the way he felt about it, but could not say, was an experience that left him strangely raw. He rerouted the irrigation channel to the orchard that same week, and 3 weeks later the apple trees showed new growth for the first time in 2 seasons. March came in wet and warm, and with it came the first of what would be many letters from the buyers. Daniel handled his correspondence at the small desk in what had been his father's study, and he had gotten into the habit of leaving the door slightly open because the room could be suffocating with it closed, and this meant that Ida, passing in the hallway, sometimes caught fragments of his work. He did not think she was listening deliberately, and she never commented on anything she might have heard, but one evening in mid-March she set a cup of coffee on the corner of his desk and said, quietly, "Are you really thinking of selling?" He looked up at her. The lamp was throwing warm light across the side of her face, and she was looking at him with an expression that was careful and neutral, the expression of someone who has asked a question and is prepared to receive any answer without reaction. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest answer he had given anyone on the subject. She nodded once and left, and he sat for a long time looking at the letter from the Austin Speculator, and then he put it in the drawer without answering it. April brought the spring cattle drive preparations, which meant Daniel was up before dawn every day and often not back until after dark, and the ranch took on the busy, purposeful energy that he had always loved about working land, the sense that everything was consequential, that every decision had a real downstream effect. Santos and the 2 other hands, a young Anglo man named Pete Holloway and an older freedman named James Carver, were in and out of the yard constantly, and the house became something different in those weeks, fuller, louder, alive in a way it hadn't been. Ida adapted without visible effort. She fed everyone. She kept the accounts Daniel asked her to manage because he had discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that she had a head for numbers and a patience for the ledgers that he found deeply useful. She and James Carver had long, quiet conversations in the evening sometimes, and Daniel, passing the kitchen door, would catch fragments, and once he heard James say something about Ohio, where he had been before the war, and Ida saying something back that was low and intent, and James laughed the deep, full laugh that was his rarest sound, and Daniel went on down the hall without making his presence known, feeling something he could not immediately name, something adjacent to gratitude. It was during the cattle drive preparations that Daniel began to notice the thing about the porch. It started as something small. He came home late one Wednesday evening to find Ida sitting on the porch in the old wooden chair his father had made, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. The night was warm and the creek frogs were going, and the sky over the hills was dense with stars. She had a cup of something in her hands, tea or coffee, and she was perfectly still, and the stillness she had was different from the stillness she had inside the house. Outside in the dark, sitting on that porch, she looked as though she had been there for years. Daniel stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said, without the slight professional tension that was usually present in their exchanges at the end of the day. "It's beautiful out tonight." He stood there for a moment, looking at the same hills he had looked at his entire life, and tried to see them the way she seemed to see them, tried to feel what she was feeling, which was something like permission, like rest. He climbed the steps and sat in the other chair, which he almost never used, and they sat together in silence for the better part of an hour, and it was the most ease Daniel had felt in 3 years. After that it became a pattern, not every night but often, especially in the spring and early summer when the evenings were long and the light lasted until well after 8 o'clock. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just sat and watched the light change on the hills, or listened to the night sounds come up one at a time, the crickets first, then the owls, then the distant coyotes back on the high ridge. When they did talk, the conversations were different from their daytime exchanges, less practical, more exploratory. She told him about Philadelphia, about the school where she had taught, about the particular girls she had loved teaching, and the ones who had made her feel that she was changing something that mattered. He told her things about the ranch that he hadn't told anyone in years, the stories his father used to tell about the early days, the first winter when the cattle had to be hand-fed, the spring his mother had planted the orchard in a fit of optimism that turned out to be entirely justified. He did not tell her about Clara, not yet. The dark past that he carried was not something he offered easily. But in May, on a warm evening when the fireflies were beginning their first tentative appearances along the creek bank, Ida said, gently and without preamble, "Tom Aldridge's wife told me about your wife. I'm sorry, I should have said so sooner, but I didn't know how." Daniel was quiet for a long time. The fireflies pulsed in the dark below the porch. "Clara," he said at last. "Her name was Clara." "Yes," Ida said, "Clara. We were married 4 years," he said. "She was a good person. She deserved better than what happened." Ida said nothing, which was exactly the right response, and Daniel, who had not talked about Clara to anyone except Tom Aldridge, and then only once, found himself talking about her, not with the compulsive grief of someone who hasn't processed their loss, but with the measured, honest pain of someone who has lived with it long enough to look at it directly. He talked about the fever, which had come on fast. He talked about the baby, whom they had named Robert for Daniel's father, and who had never taken a breath. He talked about the 2 days between Clara getting sick and Clara dying, and how every hour of those 2 days he had been certain she would be all right, certain with the irrational certainty of a man who cannot conceive of the alternative. Ida listened with her full self, the way she did everything, and when he finished she said, "The land must have helped. Land is good for grief. It keeps moving when you can't." He looked at her in the dimness, the side of her face illuminated by the distant yellow light from the sitting room window, and felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked and cold beginning very slowly to warm. "Yes," he said, "it did." The summer of 1883 brought heat and dust, and the daily intimacy of two people sharing a household and a working partnership that had grown, incrementally but undeniably, into something neither of them was quite ready to name. Daniel had taken to including Ida in his conversations about the ranch's decisions in a way that had begun as practical and had become essential. She had caught an error in the cattle tally that would have cost him $40. She had negotiated, on his behalf, a better price for the winter hay supply from a vendor in Kerrville who was, as she observed, charging him more than he charged Tom Aldridge for no discernible reason other than the vendor's assumption that Daniel wasn't paying attention. She had started a kitchen garden behind the house that by July was producing enough to substantially reduce the household's food costs. Daniel watched all of this and felt something that was not simply gratitude and not simply respect, though it was both of those things, and tried to ignore the parts that were something else. The crisis came in July. It arrived in the form of a man named Crane, a debt collector from San Antonio representing the freight concern in which Daniel had made his bad investment. The investment had soured, the concern had failed, and there was a note coming due in October that Daniel was not, by his own honest calculation, certain he could meet. Crane was not a violent man and not explicitly threatening, but he was the kind of man whose very presence reminded you of consequences, and he sat at Daniel's kitchen table and laid out the numbers with the cheerful precision of someone who enjoyed the arithmetic of other people's trouble. After Crane left, Daniel sat for a long time at the kitchen table. Ida came in from the garden with a basket of green beans and set them on the counter and looked at him and said, "How bad is it?" He told her. "All of it. The original investment, the terms of the note, the amount coming due, the gap between what he had and what he owed." It felt strange to say it all out loud, not because he was ashamed, though there was some of that, but because articulating it made it real in a different way, made it a problem that existed between two people rather than solely inside his own head. Ida sat down across from him, just as she had that first afternoon in February when they had talked about water and trees, and she was quiet for a long moment with her hands flat on the table. "What are your options?" she said. "Sell cattle above what I'd planned to this fall," he said. "That gets me part of the way. Take on a second mortgage on part of the land, which I don't want to do, or sell the ranch outright and start over somewhere, which I'm not willing to do. Or find another source of revenue," she said. "What source?" She looked at him steadily. "The south pasture, the one along the lower creek. I've been thinking about it for a couple of months. The soil down there is different from the rest of the ranch, deeper, more moisture retentive. I think you could put in a significant kitchen garden operation, not just for household use but for commercial sale in Kerrville. The hotel there is importing vegetables from San Antonio that they'd prefer to source locally if they could depend on the quality and the timing. I spoke to the hotel manager's wife at the church social in June." Daniel stared at her. "You spoke to her about this?" "I wanted to know if the idea had merit before I raised it," Ida said calmly. "She said the hotel spends approximately $30 a month on produce from San Antonio and would gladly redirect that spending locally if the quality was consistent. There's also the dry goods store and the new boarding house." She paused. "It won't cover the full amount by October, but it would help. And in subsequent years, if you built the operation carefully, it could generate significant additional income." He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was warm and smelled of garden dirt and coffee and something baking in the oven, and the light through the window was the heavy, leaden gold of a Texas July afternoon, and Ida Vaughn was sitting across from him with her hands flat on his kitchen table, having given more practical thought to saving his ranch than he had managed in 2 weeks of sleepless nights. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been thinking," she said. "There's a difference." "Why?" he said, and then stopped, because the question was larger than he'd meant it to be. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at her hands. "Because it would be a shame," she said, "for this place to be lost." The South Pasture Garden was the project that changed everything between them, because it required them to work side by side for long hours in a way that their previous arrangement had not. Daniel had thought he would oversee it and Ida would manage it, but it turned out that the thing required more intensive cultivation than he had anticipated, and Ida was in the south pasture every morning before the heat set in, and Daniel found himself drawn there too, ostensibly to make decisions, but really, he began to admit to himself, because that was where she was. They worked well together physically, which surprised him. He had not thought of Ida as a physical person, in the sense of someone accustomed to hard labor, but she worked with her whole body and she was stronger than she looked, and she had a farmer's instinct for what needed doing, and they developed, over the weeks of August, a working rhythm that required very little speech. He would start a row and she would continue it. She would identify a problem with the drainage, and he would already be reaching for the tool to fix it. There was a day in late August, an ordinary Tuesday, when they were replanting a section that had flooded after a rare summer storm, working fast before the afternoon heat made it unbearable, and they came around opposite ends of a row at the same moment and nearly collided, and he caught her by both arms to steady her. And for a moment they were very close and very still, her arms in his hands and her face tilted up toward his, and the smell of turned earth and green things all around them. And neither of them moved, and neither of them breathed, and then she stepped back and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was entirely level, and went back to work, and Daniel turned away and tried to remember what he had been doing. That evening, instead of sitting on the porch as they had been doing most evenings, Ida said she had letters to write and went to her room after supper, and Daniel sat on the porch alone for the first time in months and felt the absence of her like a physical thing, like a change in air pressure, and he thought, with a clarity that was almost shocking, "I am in love with her." The thought did not panic him, which surprised him. It settled over him like something he had been waiting for without knowing it, something that had been on its way for a long time. He sat with it for a while, the way you sit with a truth that is bigger than you expected, and the night sounds came up around him, and the stars were enormous over the hills, and he thought about Clara, and he thought about grief, and he thought about what it means when land keeps moving when you can't, and eventually he went inside and went to bed. He did not tell Ida. He was, by nature, a deliberate man, a man who did not act on feeling until he had understood the feeling thoroughly, and the situation between them was complicated by the fact that she was employed by him and had been for 6 months, and this created an imbalance that he took seriously. He needed to be sure, not just of himself but of the situation, before he said anything that could not be unsaid. September brought the first real fruits of the South Pasture Garden, and with it, a small but meaningful infusion of cash from the hotel and the dry goods store that, combined with the additional cattle sales, moved the October debt from the category of crisis to the category of manageable. Daniel paid Crane's note on the 3rd of October, 2 weeks early, and felt a relief so complete that he stood in the bank in Careville for a moment afterward and simply breathed, as if he had been holding his breath since July. When he came home and told Ida, she was at the kitchen counter, and she turned around and there was something in her face that was more than relief, something close to joy, and she said, "I'm so glad," and he believed her entirely. October in the hill country was magnificent, the light gone from summer gold to autumn copper, the deer moving through the cedar in the mornings, the air sharp and clean. The buyers had not gone away. The man from Austin had written twice more, and the San Antonio speculator had sent an agent out to look at the property in September, which Daniel had permitted because he was still calculating his options. Though with the October note paid, he felt considerably less cornered. The man from St. Louis had written a third time with an increased offer, and Daniel's attorney in Careville, a cautious man named Holt, had written to say that the offers were serious and that Daniel would be well advised to consider them carefully. Daniel considered them carefully. He spread the 3 offers on his desk one October evening and looked at them for a long time. The numbers were significant. The St. Louis offer in particular was generous enough to make a new start possible somewhere else, somewhere without debt, somewhere where he could begin again without the weight of 3 difficult years pressing on him. But he thought about the creek, and the limestone hills in the early morning, and the way the orchard looked now that the irrigation was right, and the south pasture garden that had saved him, and the fireflies in May along the creek bank. And he thought about a woman sitting in his father's chair on the porch in the dark, perfectly still, as if she had been there for years. He wrote back to all 3 with short, non-committal responses that kept the conversations open without committing to anything. The night of the 31st of October, he found Ida on the porch as usual, but she was standing at the railing rather than sitting, her hands pressed to the old pine, and she was looking out at the hills with an intensity that stopped him in the doorway. "Something wrong," he said. She turned and her expression was complicated. The neutral surface she habitually maintained fractured a little, something beneath it showing through that she quickly covered. "No," she said. "I was just thinking." He came out and stood beside her at the railing. They were close enough that he could feel the warmth of her arm near his, and the night smelled of cedar smoke from a neighbor's chimney far off. "About what?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I got a letter today from a school in San Antonio, a private girls' academy. They're looking for a literature teacher. The position pays well and the references they've provided are good." She paused. "They want an answer by the 15th of November. Daniel said nothing. "I haven't decided anything," she said, carefully. "I just wanted you to know, in case you needed to make arrangements." The word arrangements landed in the conversation like a stone into still water. "Do you want to go?" he said after a moment. She looked at him sideways in the dark, and there was something in her expression that he would have given a great deal to read clearly. "I want to know," she said, and stopped. "What do you want to know?" he said. Another pause. The cedars moved on the ridge. A nighthawk called somewhere far away. "Whether there's a reason to stay," she said very quietly. He turned to look at her fully, and she was looking at him, and the moment was absolutely still, and he felt the terrible and magnificent weight of it, the way a person can feel at the edge of something enormous, knowing that what they do next will determine everything. He said, "Ida." She said, "Daniel." They said nothing else for what felt like a very long time, and then he did something that surprised them both. He reached across and covered her hand on the railing with his, gently and entirely without hesitation, and she turned her hand over under his and held it, and they stood like that in the October dark, hands folded together on the old pine railing, while the night moved around them. They did not kiss that night. Neither of them was a person who rushed. But something had shifted irrevocably between them. Some acknowledgment had been made, and when they went inside an hour later and Ida said good night in the hallway, the good night meant something different than it had meant the night before. November arrived and the buyers became more urgent. The man from San Antonio sent a representative in person, a smooth, affable man named Ellis, who arrived on the 2nd of November and made himself comfortable in Daniel's sitting room and talked for an hour about the advantages of the offer, the flexibility of the terms, the buyer's willingness to let Daniel stay on as a ranch manager if he wished. Daniel listened to all of it, thanked Ellis politely, and said he was still considering. On the 4th of November, he and Ida had their first real quarrel. It began over the school in San Antonio. Ida had not given them an answer yet, and it was not the most comfortable arrangement, this open question between them, and Daniel had been perhaps more abrupt than he should have been when she raised the subject over breakfast, asking whether she should respond. He said, more curtly than he intended, "You should do what you think is best for yourself." And the moment the words were out of his mouth he knew they were wrong, knew they communicated the opposite of what he meant, and he watched Ida's face close down into that perfect, composed neutrality that he had come to understand was her defense against being hurt. She said, "Yes, of course," and cleared his breakfast dishes and went out to the garden, and Daniel sat at the kitchen table and felt like an absolute fool. He found her in the south pasture 2 hours later, doing work that didn't urgently need doing, and she had that expression on her face that said she was far away inside her own head, working something out, and he said, "I was wrong to say that." She looked up at him. "What I meant," he said, "is that I don't want you to go. What I said and what I meant were different things, and I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment, and then the composure broke just slightly, just enough for him to see what was underneath it, which was something bruised and hopeful and very carefully held. "Why don't you want me to go?" she said. He crouched down to her level because she was kneeling in the garden bed, and he said, "Because I am in love with you, Ida. I have been for a while, and I should have said so before now instead of making you guess at something that you shouldn't have to guess at." The silence that followed was the kind that contains its own answer, the kind that breathes. Ida said, "I wrote to the school this morning and declined the position." He stared at her. "Before I said that." "Before you said that," she confirmed, and there was a warmth in her voice that he had never heard before, something full and unguarded and entirely hers. "You already decided," he said. "I decided in August," she said, "when you caught me in the garden and then very carefully didn't do anything about it for 2 months." He laughed, which was something he hadn't done, not really, not this way, in a very long time, and she smiled at him, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen since the spring. He helped her up from the garden bed, and they stood in the south pasture with the cedar hills all around them and the sky enormous overhead, and he took her face in both hands and kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that is simultaneously a first and a last, the last moment before everything changes, and it tasted like turned earth and autumn air and something that felt very much like coming home. The practical complications were not trivial. Daniel was her employer, and Careville was a small town with small-town memories, and they were careful over the following weeks to manage the situation with the discretion that it deserved. He spoke to Tom Aldridge first because Tom was his closest friend, and because Tom had been the one to bring Ida into his life, and Tom said, "Daniel, I knew this in March," and did not elaborate. He spoke to Ida's situation with the frank regard it required. He asked her formally, one November evening on the porch, whether she would consider marrying him, and he asked it seriously and specifically, not as a remedy for the awkwardness of the situation, but because he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, and he wanted her to know that those were different things. Ida said yes, and then she said, "Ask me again inside at the table without the romance of the porch making things too easy." And he laughed again and did, sitting across from her at the kitchen table where they had had every important conversation since February, and she said yes again, without any hesitation. They set the wedding for early December, at the Careville church, a small ceremony because neither of them was a person who required grand ceremonies, attended by Tom Aldridge and his wife Mary, Santos Reyes and James Carver and Pete Holloway, and a handful of people from town who had watched Daniel Barnett walk through 3 years of grief and were glad to see him come out the other side. The minister was a solid, unhurried man who married them in 20 minutes and looked genuinely pleased to be doing it. Ida wore a dress she had made herself from blue-gray wool, and she carried a small arrangement of cedar and late-blooming wild asters, and when Daniel saw her walking toward him, she was looking at him with the same direct look she had given him the very first time they met, that February morning 8 months ago, and he thought, not for the first time, how much had changed between that day and this one, and how none of it had been what he'd planned, and how that was entirely all right. The winter of 1883 passed at Cedar Ridge in a quiet, steady happiness that Daniel had not known was possible. There was, of course, the ongoing matter of the buyers. In January of 1884, All three offers came to a head within the space of a week, which was when the San Antonio buyer sent his man Ellis back with an improved offer, and the Austin speculator arrived in person for the first time. A young, aggressively ambitious man named Mercer who clearly believed that personal presence would succeed where correspondence had not, and a telegram arrived from the St. Louis man, Hartwell, with numbers that made Daniel's attorney Holt write an urgent letter recommending immediate consideration. Daniel discussed all three with Ida, who listened to the full details of each with her characteristic thoroughness, and then said, "What do you want, Daniel?" "I want to keep the ranch," he said. "Then keep it," she said. "The question is whether we can make it work financially without selling." They sat together at the kitchen table with the ledgers between them and went through everything: the cattle income, the garden revenue, the household expenses, the remaining debts, and the projections for the coming year. The picture was not comfortable, but it was not desperate either. The South Pasture Garden had done better than projected in its first season, and the hotel contract had been expanded. If they took on some additional cattle and managed the grazing carefully, and if the garden expanded into a second section that spring, the math was tight but possible. "There's something else," Ida said, and she was looking at him with an expression that was careful and deliberate in a way he recognized as meaning she was about to say something important. "What?" he said. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Daniel looked at her, and she was watching him with that characteristic stillness, waiting, and he felt something expand in his chest so suddenly that it nearly hurt, something vast and warm and entirely without precedent in his adult life. And he got up from his chair and came around to her and put his arms around her from behind, his face against her hair, and held on. She put her hands over his and held on too. "We are absolutely not selling the ranch," he said into her hair, and she laughed, a quiet, complete laugh that was the best sound he had ever heard. The three buyers were dispatched over the following 2 weeks. Mercer, the Austin man, received a direct and final no from Daniel in person in the front yard of the ranch, and Mercer had not quite believed it and had pressed his case until Daniel said, quietly but with absolute finality, "Mr. Mercer, I was born on this land and I intend to die on it. I'd be grateful if you'd respect that and go." Mercer went. Ellis, representing the San Antonio buyer, received a letter that Ida helped Daniel draft, polite and firm in closing all available doors. The St. Louis man Hartwell received a telegram, offer declined, final answer, Barnett. That was the end of the buyers, though neither Daniel nor Ida could have known at the time that the dramatic culmination of the whole business would not come for several more months. Winter deepened, and then began its slow retreat, and Cedar Ridge in February of 1884 was, in the way that one-year-old things are, significantly different from Cedar Ridge in February of 1883. There was more warmth in the house, more evidence of 2 lives lived together. Ida's glass botanical specimens on the windowsill of the sitting room, now, alongside a small collection of arrowheads Daniel had been finding since childhood, a habit of cooking for multiple people rather than one, the small domestic changes that accumulate into a life. They talked every evening on the porch when the weather permitted, and even when it didn't, they would stand at the kitchen window with cups of coffee and watch the rain or the fog. And Daniel began to understand that what Ida had about this land and this house was not something separate from what he had about it. It was not a visitor's love or a newcomer's enchantment that would fade. It was rooted, as his was, in the specific truth of the place, the limestone and the cedar and the water and the light. In March, a new complication arrived in the form of a man named Ida Vaughn, Ida's brother, who appeared at Cedar Ridge without much warning on a Tuesday morning in early spring, having come from Philadelphia on the strength of a letter Ida had sent him in December announcing her marriage. Ida Vaughn was 32 years old, broadly built, with Ida's dark eyes and a quality of restless energy that was almost the precise opposite of his sister's settled calm. He had the look of a man who was both impressed by and slightly suspicious of anything he encountered in the world, and he spent the first day at Cedar Ridge examining everything: the house, the land, the livestock, the people, with the thoroughness of a man conducting an assessment. He assessed Daniel most thoroughly of all, and Daniel, who was not a man easily unnerved, found himself in the somewhat novel position of wanting to make a good impression, not for his own sake but for Ida's, because he could see how much her brother's opinion mattered to her beneath the surface equanimity she maintained. The conversation that settled things happened on the second evening, when Ida was in the house and Edward and Daniel were in the yard, and Edward said without much preamble, "She's the most capable person I know. Our father always said so, and our father was not a man who gave that kind of assessment lightly." "She is," Daniel said. "She gave up a good deal to come out here," Edward said. "Philadelphia isn't the wilderness, and she had standing there people who valued her." "I know," Daniel said. "I just want to know she's valued here," Edward said, and it was said plainly, without aggression, as a simple statement of brotherly concern. Daniel looked at him. "She is the reason this ranch is still mine," he said. "She is the reason I'm not selling the place my father built. She figured out the south pasture before I did, and she negotiated the contract with the hotel, and she managed the accounts during the worst 4 months I've had in years, and she is the reason I know what kind of life is possible on this land. She's valued here, Mr. Vaughn, more than I can adequately express." Edward looked at him for a moment and then nodded once with the conclusiveness of a verdict. "She told me about the porch," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been amusement. "Said it was the moment she knew she'd found a place that was hers." Daniel said nothing, but he felt the truth of it land somewhere deep in him. Edward stayed for 3 weeks, and by the end of that time, he had made himself useful in the way that men with restless energy do when they are put in proximity to work that needs doing. He had repaired the fence along the north pasture, helped with the spring planting in the south pasture, and had long conversations with James Carver about the quality of the hill country soil that left both men looking satisfied. When he left, he shook Daniel's hand and kissed Ida on the forehead and said, "I'll come back in the fall," and Daniel believed him. The spring of 1884 was the best Cedar Ridge had seen in a decade. The rains came right, not too much and not too little, and the orchard bloomed for the first time in 3 years with a fullness that was almost shocking, the white blossoms so dense on the old trees that from the porch at dawn it looked as though it had snowed in the night. The south pasture garden went in big, twice the acreage of the previous year, and Ida managed it with the precision of someone who understood that this was no longer just a financial strategy but an established operation, a real part of what Cedar Ridge was. James Carver, who had been with Daniel for 5 years, quietly expanded his role in the garden operation and became, by early summer, its primary day-to-day manager, while Ida shifted toward the accounting and the contracts and the relationship with the buyers in town. This was something that happened naturally, over weeks, with no formal discussion, and when Daniel noticed the reorganization, he observed to Ida that they seemed to have created a functioning business without particularly intending to. "Intentions are overrated," Ida said, not looking up from the ledger. "Things tend to become what they need to be if you pay attention." The baby came in August. They had engaged the services of the most experienced midwife in Careville, a formidable woman of Spanish heritage named Luisa Herrera, who had been delivering babies in the hill country for 30 years and had, as Santos Reyes told Daniel with characteristic understatement, never lost a mother. Daniel had told Ida about Clara, about the real shape of his fear, not in a single conversation but in small portions over many months, the way you can bear to tell someone your worst things, and Ida had received each portion with the same steady attention she brought to everything, and she had said, once, sitting on the porch in the spring, "I am not Clara." I am strong and I am going to be all right, and you should let yourself believe that. He had tried. He had not entirely succeeded. The days leading up to the birth were the longest he had spent since 1879. Luisa Herrera arrived on a Sunday morning in mid-August, when it became clear that Ida's time was coming, and she established herself in the house with the air of a general taking command of a strategic position, and she sent Daniel to work in the horse barn and told him to stay there until she came to get him. He stayed in the horse barn. He could not have said afterward how long he was there. Santos was there too, ostensibly working on the tack, and neither of them said much, and at some point Santos said, "She is strong, that woman," in the tone of someone stating a fact, and Daniel said, "I know," and they went on being quiet together in the way of people who are waiting for something that cannot be hurried. Luisa came to the barn door in the late afternoon. "Come," she said. "You have a son." The walk from the barn to the house was 20 yards, and it felt like it took a very long time. He went inside and down the hall and into the room, and the light was different in there. Late afternoon light through the white curtains, very soft, and Ida was in the bed, and she was pale and tired, and her eyes were bright and alive, and she was holding a small, red, furious-looking person who was absolutely and obviously real. "His name is Robert," Ida said, looking up at him. "If that's all right." He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and at his wife, and something in his face must have said everything that needed saying, because Ida reached over and took his hand and held it tightly, and he held hers back. "It's all right," he said, through something thick in his throat. "It's more than all right." Little Robert Barnett grew from a small, furious person into a larger, more deliberate one over the following months, with Ida's eyes and Daniel's determination, and a quality of interested attention to everything around him that reminded Daniel more than once of the way his mother had described him as a child. The house at Cedar Ridge was fuller and warmer and louder than it had been in any living memory, and Daniel found himself, as the autumn of 1884 drew in a state of life that he had stopped believing was available to him. Ida Vaughn returned in October, as he had promised, and this time he stayed longer, 6 weeks, and by the end of that visit it was clear that he was not entirely unattached to the idea of the hill country. He had been spending time in Careville, and he had made the acquaintance of a young woman there named Helen Morris, the daughter of the feed store owner, and he managed to mention her in conversation 3 times on the last evening before he had to leave, each mention in a different context, and each time with a transparency that both Daniel and Ida found deeply endearing. "He'll be back in the spring," Ida said, after Edward's wagon had disappeared down the ranch road. "For Helen Morris," Daniel said. "Among other things," she said, smiling. He was right, as it turned out. Edward returned the following March, and he and Helen Morris were married in June of 1885 in a ceremony considerably larger than Daniel and Ida's, at which Daniel was best man, and Ida stood as matron of honor, and Robert, now almost a year old, was carried at the back of the church by Santos, and showed absolutely no interest in remaining quiet for the duration of the ceremony, which everyone agreed was appropriate. Edward and Helen set up a modest life in Careville, where Edward found work in the land surveying office, a job that suited his energy and his eye for detail, and they became a regular presence at Cedar Ridge, Sunday dinners and holidays, and the kind of easy family proximity that is one of the specific gifts of the West, the way that distance, having already been crossed once at great cost, becomes afterward irrelevant. Cedar Ridge by the fall of 1885 was a place transformed. The South Pasture Garden operation had expanded to include a regular contract with a second hotel in Fredericksburg, the next town over, and Ida had negotiated a price for dried herbs that the San Antonio apothecary trade paid at a premium. The cattle herd was back to its pre-drought numbers. The orchard had produced its first commercial crop, a modest thing but real, and the apples had gone to a German community to the east who made a cider that was, by all accounts, excellent. The debts were paid, all of them. Not only the freight concern note, but the smaller debts that had accumulated over the lean years. The account at the Careville dry goods store. The balance owed to Tom Aldridge for a loan made in kindness in 1881. Everything. Cleared methodically and completely. And when the last of them was settled in September of 1885, Daniel sat at his father's desk in the study for a long time and felt the weight of it lift. Not all at once, but in stages, like a horizon clearing. He came out to the porch that evening, and Ida was there, as she so often was, her hands on the railing, watching the last light go off the hills. "It's done," he said. "All of it." She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the most open and complete and loving thing he had ever seen on anyone, and she said, "I know. I checked the ledger this afternoon." He came and stood beside her at the railing, and they stood together in the evening, and the creek frogs were starting up in the bottomland, and the first star was appearing above the high ridge to the east, and he said, "This porch," and she laughed, because she knew exactly what he meant. "The very first thing I said to myself when I saw this place," she said. "I thought, that porch is someone's whole heart on the outside of a house. I thought, whoever built this porch loved something." "Father built it," Daniel said. "He built it for my mother so she could sit and watch the hills in the evenings. She sat on it every night of her adult life until she died." "I know," Ida said. "Tom's wife told me." He looked at her sideways. "Tom's wife tells you a great deal." "She does," Ida agreed, entirely unapologetically. They stood there in the quiet for a while, and then Ida said, "I have something to tell you." "All right," he said. "Robert is going to have a brother or sister," she said. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1886, delivered again by Luisa Herrera with her usual formidable competence. And they named her Clara, which was a decision that had required no discussion at all, that had simply been understood between them as the right thing, a gift given forward, a name carried on into a better day. Clara Barnett was, from the beginning, entirely her own person, louder than her brother at the same age, with a forceful and opinionated quality that Ida said reminded her of her grandmother, and Daniel said reminded him of Ida, which made Ida laugh and which he maintained was not a criticism. Robert received his sister with the cautious interest of a not quite 2-year-old confronting an unexpected development, and within a month had appointed himself her principal guardian and protector, which was, Daniel observed, going to be interesting as she grew older and demonstrated increasing signs of not requiring anyone's protection. The summer of 1886 was a good one at Cedar Ridge. The rains came steadily, and the land responded with the lush, extravagant growth of well-watered hill country in June, everything green and moving, the creek running clear and full, the orchard heavy with young fruit. Santos Reyes, who had been with Daniel for 7 years, married a woman from a neighboring ranch that summer, a quiet and capable woman named Rosa, and they moved into the small foreman's house that Daniel and Santos had built together the previous winter, and the ranch community that Cedar Ridge had become felt more complete for it. James Carver had, in the preceding year, begun to speak about land of his own, and Daniel had been thinking about what he might do to help that happen. The injustice of the situation was one he thought about carefully, and with discomfort. The fact that James had put years of labor and skill into Cedar Ridge and had built the garden operation into something real, and yet the pathways available to a black man in Texas in 1886 for acquiring land of his own were narrow and hostile in ways that made Daniel angry when he thought about them directly. He did what he could, which was imperfect. He wrote a letter of strong recommendation for James to the land office in Austin. He spoke personally to the banker in Careville. He provided a portion of James's wages in the form of land building savings held at the bank under James's name, an arrangement James had accepted with the dignified practicality of a man who understood both what was being offered and what was behind it. It was a beginning. Not enough, but a beginning. Ida had her own strong opinions about this, which she expressed to Daniel privately and to anyone in Careville who raised the subject with casual prejudice in her hearing, which she did not let pass without comment, and which earned her a reputation in town as a woman with views, said in some quarters with admiration and in others with irritation, and she received both assessments with equanimity. By the autumn of 1886, Cedar Ridge was producing at a level that exceeded anything in the ranch's previous history. The combination of the cattle operation, the garden business, and the orchard had created a diversified income that was more resilient than any single operation could be, and the financial pressure that had defined the first years of Daniel's adult stewardship of the ranch was, at last, genuinely gone. He was 35 years old, and he was living the life he had been born to live, on the land he had been born to love, with a woman he had not known was possible, and 2 children who made the world larger and more demanding and more astonishing in equal measure. There were difficult things, because there always are. A drought scare in the late spring of 1887 that resolved itself without catastrophe, but kept them both sleepless for 2 weeks. A disagreement with a Kerrville merchant who had shorted the ranch on a payment, which Ida handled with a direct efficiency that Daniel thought was magnificent to observe. A fever that went through the household in the winter of 1887 that laid them all low in turn, the children included, and which was frightening until it wasn't. And there were wonderful things, because there are always those too. The evening in the summer of 1887 when Robert, now nearly 3 years old, followed Daniel out to the horse corral at dawn, and stood at the fence beside him in the early light with his small hands on the bottom rail and his chin resting on the top rail, looking at the horses with the expression of someone witnessing something very important. And Daniel looked at him and felt such a clean, uncomplicated joy that it was almost surprising. A joy without any of the ambivalence that had characterized his emotional life for so many years. The evening that Ida read aloud to them from a novel on the porch, the children asleep inside, the summer dark warm and full of sounds, and Daniel, listening to her voice move through the words, thought that he could do this for the rest of his life, simply sit here and listen to her read and be entirely content. The day they rode out together, just the 2 of them, something they rarely managed, while Mary Aldridge watched the children, and went up to the high ridge on the eastern edge of the property where you could see for 30 miles in 3 directions, and stood at the top in the afternoon wind, and looked at everything Cedar Ridge was and had, the hills and the creek and the orchard and the south pasture green with late summer growth, and Ida said, "Your father chose well," and Daniel said, "He'd have liked you." And she looked at him with the most luminous expression he had ever seen. In 1888, Cedar Ridge got a proper vegetable house, a stone structure along the north wall of the garden area that allowed for a modest amount of winter cultivation, and for the storage of the dried herbs and preserved goods that were now a meaningful part of the commercial operation. Daniel and Santos built it together over 6 weeks in the late fall, and Ida designed the interior arrangement with her characteristic practicality. And when it was done, it was solid and useful and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been built for a real purpose with real care. James Carver acquired his own land that year, 12 acres on the east side of Kerrville, and the day the deed was recorded Daniel shook his hand, and Ida brought out a cake she had made, which James accepted with the composed dignity of a man who has earned something and knows it, and does not need to make a performance of the fact. The house at Cedar Ridge was added to in the spring of 1889, a second bedroom for the children and a larger study for Daniel. The study because the correspondence and the account books had expanded to the point where the old desk in the small room was genuinely insufficient. Ida oversaw the construction with the focused attention she brought to everything she judged important, which meant the contractor, a reliable German craftsman from Fredericksburg named Werner, was given extraordinarily detailed specifications and met them to the letter. Robert started at the Kerrville School in the fall of 1889, which made him solemn and important for approximately 2 weeks before he settled into the ordinary patterns of childhood and began coming home with the enthusiastic complaints of someone discovering the social complexities of a classroom. Clara, 2 years his junior, watched this development with intense, proprietary interest and made it clear that she was prepared to attend school immediately, regardless of the conventional age requirements, a position that the school was not yet prepared to accommodate but which no one doubted she would eventually enforce. The porch was repaired in the spring of 1890, the boards replaced where the years had worn them thin, and Daniel did it himself over 2 weekends, taking his time, fitting the new boards with care, matching the old pine as closely as he could find. When it was done, Ida ran her hand along the new boards and nodded and said, "Good." And that was all, and that was enough. They stood on it that evening, all four of them, the April air soft and smelling of cedar and new grass, and the children ran the length of it 3 times in the pure animal delight of children who have just discovered that a structure they have known their whole lives has become novel again. And Daniel and Ida stood at the railing with their shoulders touching and watched the light go off the hills. "You know," Daniel said, "the first time I realized what was happening between us was when I found you standing at this railing one night in October, before we'd said anything, before any of it." Ida looked at him. "I know," she said. "I felt you realize it." He laughed. "You felt it." "I felt it," she confirmed. "I thought he's standing very still in a way he doesn't usually stand still, and I should probably not look at him directly because if I do one of us is going to have to say something that will change everything." "Why didn't you look?" he said. "I looked," she said. "Eventually." "You waited long enough," he said. "So did you," she said, and he could not argue with that. The decade turned. The 1890s came in with a drier, harder quality than the 1880s had had, the hill country going through one of its periodic cycles of reduced rainfall, and Cedar Ridge felt it, as every ranch in the region did. But the diversified operation that Ida had helped build proved its worth in those years, the garden revenue holding more stable than the cattle income, the orchard providing returns even in years when the range grasses were short. Daniel turned 40 in 1891, and Ida threw him a party that he had not asked for and did not expect, inviting the Aldridges and Edward and Helen, who now had 3 children of their own, and Santos and Rosa, and a dozen people from Careville, including the banker who had helped him refinance in the dark years and Luisa Herrera, and the hotel manager's wife, who had first shaken hands on the garden contract. It was the largest gathering Cedar Ridge had seen, and Daniel stood in the middle of it and felt, not the self-consciousness of a man not accustomed to being celebrated, but a genuine warmth, the warmth of a man who has, over the years, accumulated people, who has built not just a ranch but a life. In the summer of 1892, Ida discovered she was expecting a 3rd child, and this time both of them received the news with a happiness that was unclouded by fear. Luisa Herrera having supervised 2 successful deliveries, and having given every indication of being prepared to supervise a 3rd with the same unflappable authority. The 3rd child was a boy, born in January of 1893, and they named him Thomas, for Tom Aldridge, who had stood by Daniel through the worst, and who received the honor with a deep, visible emotion that he covered almost immediately with bluff practicality, and which Daniel and Ida pretended not to notice. By the mid-1890s, Cedar Ridge was a working, thriving, beautiful ranch with 3 children growing up on it who were going to know, as Daniel had always known, that they were born to a particular piece of land, and a particular light, and a particular quality of life that was worth everything it cost. Robert, the eldest, took to the cattle operation with a seriousness that delighted Daniel, spending his afternoons after school with Santos and later, as Santos aged, gradually taking on more of the practical ranching work with the quiet competence of someone who has absorbed the knowledge of a place over a lifetime. He was, by his mid-teens, capable and steady, and Daniel could see his father's particular brand of unhurried determination in everything Robert did. Clara was educated, first at Careville and then, at her own insistence, at the Women's College in San Marcos, which she had read about at the age of 11 and declared her intention of attending, and which she did attend beginning in 1901. She wrote long, detailed letters home that were full of her opinions about everything: the curriculum, her professors, her fellow students, the politics of the institution, all of it expressed with a precision and conviction that Ida read aloud at the kitchen table to Daniel, and which made them both laugh with admiration and relief. Thomas was quieter than his siblings, a dreamer and a naturalist who spent his boyhood collecting specimens, the way Ida had collected her glass-breast flowers, rocks and insects and seed pods, and the bones of small animals, building an inventory of the natural world of Cedar Ridge that was extraordinarily detailed. He was going to be a teacher, or perhaps a scientist, in some field not yet determined, and the way he moved through the world, paying intense and loving attention to everything, reminded Daniel with a sweet, complex feeling of someone he had loved very much. It was Robert who came to him one evening in the early fall of 1898 when Robert was 14 years old and said, "Papa, a man came by today when you were in town, from Austin, said he was interested in buying the ranch." Daniel looked at his son. "What did you tell him?" Robert said without any drama. "I told him it wasn't for sale." Daniel looked at his son for a moment longer, and something passed between them that was the particular transmission of a man recognizing himself in the person he has made, the values and the loves passed on without ceremony, through the daily substance of a life lived in full view. "Good answer," Daniel said. The evening of their 15th wedding anniversary, in December of 1898, Daniel and Ida sat on the porch in the cold, wrapped in wool blankets with cups of coffee, and watched the winter stars over the Cedar Hills. The children were inside, all three of them, the sounds of their voices and their movement coming through the closed door as a kind of music, the specific music of a full house. 15 years, Ida said. 15 years, he agreed. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the first day. When I stepped off the stage in Careville and Santos came to collect me in the wagon, and I thought, well, here is the life I chose, and I had no idea what it would be, not really. You can read all the letters you want and you still don't know. What did you think when you first saw the house?" he said. "I thought it was exactly what a house ought to look like," she said. "I thought someone had built it to last, which is a rare thing. And then I saw the porch and I thought, whoever lives here has a sense of what matters. And then you met me," he said. "And then I met you," she agreed. "And you were standing at the fence looking at horses like a man who had forgotten what people were for, and I thought, this is going to take patience." He laughed. "It did take patience." "Everything worth having takes patience," she said, with the conviction of someone who has proved this empirically over 15 years. He reached over and took her hand under the wool blanket, and she held his in both of hers, and the night was very cold and very clear, and the cedar trees were dark and still on the ridgeline, and the creek was a sound in the distance, faithful and continuous. "I am grateful," he said, not to the night or the stars or the land, though he was grateful to all of those things too, but to her directly and specifically. "So am I," she said, looking at him. The years went on in the way that good years do, each one different and each one the same in the ways that matter, the seasons turning over Cedar Ridge, the land doing what land does when it is cared for, the work continuing with the unhurried daily urgency of a working ranch, the children growing and the house full, and the porch occupied in the evenings as it always had been, first by 2 people, and then sometimes by 5, by the family that had been built there slowly and with love. Daniel Barnett lived on Cedar Ridge until he was very old, and he worked the land until he could not, and then he sat on the porch in the afternoons and watched Robert work, and later Robert's children, his grandchildren, who came to sit with him there and who received, without knowing it, The same gift the land had always given, the sense that something large and real and true was waiting just at the edge of the hills, and that if you sat still long enough and paid attention, you might come to understand it. Ida outlived him by 4 years, and she sat on that porch every evening of those 4 years, her hands on the pine railing, watching the light change on the limestone hills, and everyone who knew her understood that what she had said that October day in 1883, pressed into the wood of an old porch with her palms, had been not a casual observation but a declaration, a staking of claim. A recognition between a woman and a place that this was where she belonged, and that she had found it and she was staying. The 3 buyers never came back. There were other inquiries over the years, because good land always draws eyes, but Daniel declined them all with the same finality, and after a time the word got around that Cedar Ridge was not for sale and never would be, and the inquiry stopped. The porch stood. The orchard grew. The south pasture garden expanded and expanded again over the decades, according to the needs of the market and the weather and the people managing it. But it was always there, always producing, the thing that had saved the ranch in the year it needed saving, begun by a woman from Philadelphia who had wanted to understand the land. The last light of a September evening in the hill country has a quality unlike any other light in the world, going from gold to rose to a deep amber that seems almost liquid, pouring over the limestone ridges and pooling in the creek valleys. And it was in this light, on a night in 1885, that Daniel Barnett looked at Ida standing at the railing of his father's porch with her palms pressed to the old pine wood, and understood that a person could love a place and a person simultaneously and completely, that these loves were not in competition, but were, at their core, the same love, the love of something real and particular and worthy of permanence. He had turned down 3 offers for everything his family had built. He would have turned down 30. He would have turned down any number, because some things are not for sale, not the land, not the light, not the woman standing in the evening with her hands on the railing, not the life that had grown up around all of it like the cedar trees grow on the limestone hills, slowly and surely, and with roots that go all the way down to water. The porch is still there. The railing has been replaced twice more since Daniel put in the new boards in 1890. The orchard his mother planted in a fit of optimism still produces. The creek still runs in the bottomland below the house, and in the late evenings when the frogs begin their singing and the first stars come out above the eastern ridge, the sound of it carries all the way up to the porch, as it always has, faithful and unchanging and full of everything that matters. That is the story of Cedar Ridge, and of Daniel Barnett and Ida Vaughn, and of a porch that was someone's whole heart on the outside of a house, and of what it means when a person finds the place they were meant to be, and the person they were meant to be with, all in the same moment, on the same autumn evening, with their hands on old pine wood and their whole lives opening up before them like the view from a limestone hill on a clear Texas morning, wide and real, and entirely their own.